over now to Becky Hancock, who's the executive director of the Historic Tennessee Theatre, and with Jack Neely. So let's see where they are today. Jack and Becky, are you there?
Yeah. We are here at the Tennessee Theater, and this is not a virtual backdrop. As you can tell, if I turn my face, my nose doesn't disappear. This is the actual. We are in the Tennessee Theater, the 92-year-old motion picture palace known as the Tennessee Theater, one of the great jewels of East Tennessee. And grateful to have the director of the Tennessee Theater Foundation, Becky Hancock, here with us, who's been here working with the Tennessee Theater a long time. We're in full lockdown now. What's it like?
Yeah, it's sad. I tell you, I miss having this building full of people. As you can see, the seats behind me are empty. Our show was on March 13th. Seems in one way like a million years ago, in other ways, I believe it's already the end of July. Because of the local and the statewide condition of the pandemic, we don't expect to be returning to regular activity, what all of you would presume to be regular activity with touring shows and concerts, for quite a long time. The artists are not wanting to tour. Those productions, Broadway shows are not touring. Some of you may know that Broadway New York is shut down until at least January 3rd. So we expect the rest of 2020 to be pretty quiet. If the caseload, the COVID caseload improves and we get things under control locally, and the capacity limits for indoor activity possible, we might do some things locally for 100 or few hundred people. But in terms of a sold out Broadway show, sold out concert, or a symphony concert, we just don't know when that's going to happen. So it's been very hard. Typically we're on about a $9 million budget, and we estimate that the shows and events that we've already canceled, that we will have to cancel before we're back to normal, it's probably going to be over $4 million in lost revenue. So it is a significant blow to this historic theater and to this nonprofit organization.
Yeah, and it's a blow to Knoxville as well. The Tennessee Theater is one of the most famous places in Knoxville. There's no question about that. And we're reminded about that every time they have a Big Ears Festival. And that was unfortunately, one of the first things canceled this year was the Big Ears Festival, which always made use of this theater. And one thing all these reporters from London to Los Angeles say about Knoxville is this amazing theater. To Fabergé eggs or ocean liners or all the other metaphors people use to describe the wonderful Tennessee. And by the way, Becky and I are cognizant of lockdown. We're unmasked, but we're 60 feet apart on this very broad, one of the broadest stages around the Tennessee Theater stage. But it's we're here. People have asked me, has there been a time that Tennessee has been locked down for an epidemic? And the Bijou certainly has. The Bijou was locked down for a month, which seemed like a long time then. But this is the first time Tennessee has ever had to deal with an emergency like this. This is the longest that Tennessee, unlike a lot of other historical theaters, it was never really abandoned. There was always people trying to make things happen for it. But this is the longest it's been closed, certainly since the giant renovation, which more than that's more a restoration, expansion, all the things
the above.
15 years ago it was finished, and it's just been a very well used. And I think almost everything that's happened in my hometown that's made Knoxville seem city in recent years, sadly, has had to do with bringing a lot of people together in places like the Tennessee and the Bijou, and having kind of communal fun and enjoying something all together, and that's something we're out. But Becky, how did you get involved in the Tennessee Theater? You've been here in one way or another quite a long time. I can remember before you were here.
So I'm a Knoxville native. I grew up in South Knoxville, went to Doyle High School, which I will staunchly Defense is different than South Doyle. A lot of people say, oh, you went to South Doyle. Nope, I went to Doyle High School. I was a 1988 graduate. Went to University of Tennessee. I got a degree in music history and double major in German and music history. And I've always loved being involved in performing, but never wanted to be performing on stage. I wanted to be helping things happen behind the scenes. I moved to New York City, worked for about 6 years in public relations for classical musicians. And I loved my time in New York, but it was expensive. I started as home. So I moved back to Knoxville to work for AC Entertainment, the management company of the theater in 2000. So I worked as the general manager here from 2000 to 2000. And I'm sure many of you know that's just a period that's 2 years before, during, and 2 years after the renovation period of the theater. And then I went to Knox Heritage as the development director or the assistant director. And I'm sure many of you know about Knox Heritage as well. And but then I was lucky to become executive director of the foundation. So now I do a lot less of the day-to-day operations to run the theater and make the shows happen. Now I'm more involved in, you know, board relations, fundraising, community relations, and really thinking a little bit longer vision term, you know, longer term and future vision of the theater and where we want it to go, where the board leadership wants the theater to go, and working management team at AC Entertainment as well.
Yeah. I want to talk about what you're doing with the theater now. There was a bit of a surprise when I walked into the lobby today. Later on, we'll bring that up later on, and we can close with that. But there's something that the theater is not entirely unused right now. There's some interesting little exceptions here and there, and we'll talk about that later. But the Tennessee Theater is its history, and I want to talk about that a little bit. It is 92 years old. Several years ago, I had the privilege of working with Becky and Bill Snyder and Tim Burns, who's here with us this evening, and a few others about the history of Tennessee Theater. And we came up with a big, beautiful, handsome. I can't claim credit for any of the superlatives people give to this book about the Tennessee Theater, because it's just the art direction by Rodney Easter people, and the pictures that you found, and all those things are what really make it astonishing. But it does have an amazing story. The Tennessee Theater was first conceived 100 years ago. We could even call this a centennial this year of the idea of the Tennessee Theater, because it was in 1920, the same year we passed the 19th Amendment. In 1920, that it was first announced that something was going to happen here, and it kind of took a little bit of the air out of this big announcement of another theater called the Riviera, which opened that year. The Riviera Theater opened just on the street on Gay Street, and was a beautiful, big, gorgeous theater. But with more than 1,000 seats, it was bigger than any other movie theater in town at the time. But when they opened the Riviera Theater, they said, this is impressive, but just wait, we're going to do something even bigger over on the next corner of Clinch, and wait and see it happen. It took longer than anybody thought it would, the Tennessee Theater, but the Paramount organization out of Hollywood was behind this giant effort, with cooperation of local landowners, to build this motion picture palace. And anybody who's an architecture geek like me is fascinated with the Tennessee Theater, both the appearance of it and kind of the contradiction of it in its time. The 1920s was the time that we were supposed to be getting simpler and simpler architecture. It was modernism, it was the international style, it was the Bauhaus, and we were building some modernist buildings in downtown, like the Daylight Building, with lots of windows and very simple, very minimal ornamentation. And then here come these architects from Chicago, Graven and Mager, a couple of young guys who didn't get along very well for very long, but they came down here and designed this astonishing landmark, which was just over the top in so many respects, and just the opposite, completely ran the opposite from what architecture was doing at the time. But open, and it was during a period that was called the Moorish Revival period, and it was a period that lasted only about 5 years, literally. All the Moorish Revival theaters in America are from this period from 1925 to 1930. That's it. And but it was during that period that that the Tennessee Theater was built, and a handful of other. Becky, do you know how many other Moorish Revival theaters there are in America? It's not a lot. A lot of them have been torn down over the years or modified out of character.
I don't know. Well, I can tell the viewers that there's only one other major motion picture movie palace that was designed by Graven and Mager that is still standing today, and that is in Birmingham, Alabama, the Alabama Theater. So
Yeah.
a little bit larger, a year or two older than the Tennessee. So it is thought of as a sister theater, and there are some similarities in that Moorish Revival design, but I think ours is a little bit more specifically Moorish than theirs is.
Yeah, and it has dogwoods, which dogwood blossoms, which theirs does
right.
not. And we think that Graven and Mager came here in the springtime, and they saw dogwood trees blossoming, and they said, we need to use that in this design, and put them up around the proscenium theater. Anyway, it opened to great fanfare in 1928. It was another thing that made the Tennessee Theater distinct. I don't know if it was I think it was the very first theater to be air conditioned. This was something that in Knoxville were in lockdown during the summer for many years, not because of any disease, but because it was too damn hot to be in a theater. And they were stifling hot, and people just realized that. And sometimes they had outdoor events during the summer.
We believe that this was the first building in Knoxville to be designed with air conditioning. So there were other buildings retrofitted, like the Miller's building, the department store. But in terms of in the original design, which we still use, the original air handling system, the general functionality of the air system is the same. It was fully rated, but a lot of the concepts, the engineering concepts, are the same.
Yeah, well, I have to say though, in 1928, they didn't promise that it would always be cool. They said it would be 20 degrees cooler than the outside. So if it was 105 outside, it might be 85 here. But that was their. I don't know what it felt like, but anyway, but they designed this amazing place in 1928, and it was instantly popular, obviously, and it was a motion picture palace. Movies were the main thing. Paramount was the juggernaut that created a lot of these theaters, and they did it to make money off of movies. But they didn't have just movies, did they? In the early days, it was they had to begin with they had the Wurlitzer organ, and that does make the Tennessee Theater distinct. It has the original, and Becky's going to show it. It's right here during the stage with it. But that Wurlitzer organ is the original 1928 model. It's been renovated a couple of times over the years. It's a fine-tuned, kind of a specialized, but it's one of the very few theaters in the world that has its original mighty Wurlitzer organ from the 1920s. And a lot of theaters have been through renovations and have brought back a Wurlitzer organ, but not the original one like this one. But it was played the night it opened in October of 1928 by what was the lady's name?
Jean Wilson.
Jean Wilson, that's right, was the first organist here at the theater. Of course, a lot of us are familiar with Bill and other organists in more recent years, but that they would open with an organ piece, and then they would have and look on this program here. It says the program is Don Pedro and his Melody Boys. They were a jazz band that had been at the Riviera Theater before the Tennessee opened. And they came here, and they were the house band for the first several months. There was a band, whether you wanted to hear it or not, you would hear a band concert every night with a movie show for a while. Don Pedro and his Melody Boys would come out, and they would have a different theme every night. And then they would often have typically would have a vaudeville show too. And vaudeville might include a comedian, an acrobat, a pop singer, a mind reader, all sorts of, it might be an animal act, but, you know, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about those later, but you would see a whole kind of a banquet of shows, kind of a pageant of different kinds of live shows, and then you would get to the newsreels and the cartoons and the feature film. And in those days, the reason Tennessee had to be so big, much bigger than any movie theater today, is that movies were just in a town for 3 days typically. And so if you wanted to see a new movie, if you wanted to see the Marx Brothers and the Coconuts, it was just going to be here in Knoxville for 3 days, pal. You need to, you know, cram yourself into the Tennessee Theater at one of the times it's open. It's there, and it might come back if it's a popular movie. It might come back at one of the other theaters, but it might not too. So that's why the theater was packed every night for, and had at that time about 2,000 seats in here. So it's amazing how many people saw movies here. I think the most popular movie ever shown here certainly in 1 week was a movie called Snow White, and it was held over for 6 days at the Tennessee Theater. And in those 6 days, 70,000 people saw the movie Snow White in this one room that held at that time 2,000 people. It was a phenomenon. It just shows how a movie was so much of an event. You couldn't think, I'll catch it next week. You might not be here next week, but anyway, you had all that, but you also had these live shows. And when I wrote the book, I had some lists that some older people who had good memories had very dutifully made lists of all the famous people who had performed here over the years. And the lists were helpful to give me something to look for, but they didn't have any clue about when it was or what the context was. They knew that Glenn Miller was here, or that Fifi Dorsey was here, some people said, and some people doubted that. Desi Arnaz was here, that who else? A lot of the performers, Helen Hayes. Helen Hayes, I was talking about the width of the stage. This is the same stage that intimidated Helen Hayes, the seasoned Broadway actress who came out here, and she had never performed on a stage this wide before. And she said, I didn't know how to deal with this. It was a bigger theater to begin with more people seeing the Broadway show. It was a show called Mary of Scotland. But she was one of the many people that were here. And my job in writing the history was to try to triangulate with the help of Tim and other people who knew some, a clue here, a clue there, and crank through microfilm. This would have been, Becky, this book would have been so much easier to do now, because you could just look up stuff on oldnewspapers.com or something and find out when they were. But I did just I cranked through miles of microfilm at McClung Collection to get all these great stories. But I proved that every story that people told was true. Even the Tom Mix story. People had started to doubt the Tom Mix story. That Tom Mix, the famous cowboy star from Hollywood, a big guy with a big horse, had been here at some point and had his horse up here on stage. But they said, how could he have done that? The only way to get the horse in would have been to bring it in through the lobby, through the aisles of the seats, and up these little stairways on the sides of the stairs. But that's exactly what they did. And it was not just Tom Mix and his horse Tony. It was there was another horse or two as well. They had a little mini rodeo here on stage in 1933 for 4 nights in a row. But with acrobats above, doing trapeze work above. So sometimes the stories are even crazier than they seem at first. It's even more unbelievable than they might have seemed at first. But this was, here's an ad for that Tom Mix thing, and it was a Night of a Ginger Rogers movie. I think this was before she met Fred Astaire, probably. But anyway, this is there's so many fascinating stories about these shows. And surprisingly, the vaudeville kind of faded in the early 30s. They had a different mix of vaudeville stars every night, and they would have some pop stars. Gene Austin was here several times at the Tennessee Theater in the 20s. He was famous for lots of recordings, including My Blue Heaven. You may remember that, Becky. But it's anyway. It's but quite a few jazz bands that were well known at the time performed here. But one of my favorite vaudeville performers, I think the one that I had to find out more about was a guy named Haji Ali, who was here in the late 20s, I believe, but he was a regurgitation specialist. He was a performer who he got up on the stage and swallowed things and fired them out of his stomach at a target across the stage. He would drink gallons of water and just spew it like a fire hose, and then he would swallow steel balls and he would shoot them like torpedoes across the stage. An amazing guy. I thought it was all made up, but I found out that we actually got a piece of a clip from a Laurel and Hardy movie that he made and did some of these things in the movie that he did here on the stage. But so many great stories. Earl Carroll's Vanities was here a few times, and this is surprising. Tennessee Theater is mainly a family place. But Earl Carroll's Earl Carroll was known as the flesh peddler and the troubadour of the nude. I don't think he had anyone who was actually nude on stage, but he flirted with the idea. But several things. He was the one who did bring Fifi D'Orsay, the kind of Fifi D'Orsay from Gay Paris, who actually had never been to France in her life. I think she was from Canada. But anyway, she was here. She was indeed here singing and dancing one night. But the single biggest show that we had here, and I don't think the Broadway at the Tennessee thing will be able to touch this except in total attendance over a period of days. Probably no show ever will bring as many people as Ziegfeld's Follies in 1935. And the reason is that they didn't have the same fire codes we have now, and they allowed 100 people to buy standing room only seats in the back. By some accounts, almost 2,500 people were here in the theater to see this amazing thing. The only time that Ziegfeld's Follies ever toured the South, that came to Knoxville, and with its star, the great comedian and singer Fanny Brice, who of course Barbara Streisand later portrayed in the Funny Girl movies. There's a picture of her, yeah, when she was probably a bit younger than she was when she was here, but. Anyway, but that's one of the great one of the great nights to have been here. One of the legendary nights to have been at the Tennessee Theater was that night in 1935. That Fanny Brice and a big cast of, they had about 20 different skits were part of this Follies thing, and she was in 7 or 8 of them, and they would have other things while she was changing costumes. So it was quite a night. Paul, do we have any other images from that? From those era that
Becky wanted to talk about Joe Parrott.
Oh yeah, of course, Joe Parrott. I'm glad you brought that up, Becky, because that's he was here mainly in that early era of right after the Tennessee Theater opened. Tennessee Theater had a staff artist. You want to say more about him? I can.
No, actually, you know a whole lot more about Joe Parrott than I do, but I think it's, knowing what we do now to promote shows, and it's almost all digital, right? And to think what they did week in and week out, but in hard, in cardboard and wood, stuff like that.
Yeah.
That was a lobby presentation that probably only lasted a week, and then they threw it away. So.
Yeah, that's right. Here's I mentioned earlier the Marx Brothers Coconuts. This is their first movie was shown here at the Tennessee Theater literally the day before it was released. It's amazing how they got things out of Hollywood, but the official release date was the day before it actually was day after it was actually being shown at the Tennessee Theater. But this was a big ad. This is not superimposed. This is walking out of the lobby toward Gay Street. You can see the architecture there today, but these big pieces of advertising designed and painted and cut by by Joe Parrott. How many movie theaters today have you ever heard of who had a staff artist? This guy worked for about 4 years or so here anyway, as had a actual studio back in the rooms alongside the dressing rooms and backstage.
And of course, when I look at this picture, I think fire code. They have half of the doors blocked with these.
Yeah.
This would not fly today. Just so you know. But.
Yeah, fire codes ruin so many things. Save lives occasionally, but still. Anyway, it's but he did a different thing every 3 days or so. Put up a new batch of advertisements, and then they just threw them all away. Just imagine what just one of these might be worth today on Antiques Roadshow or something. If you could find anything like this, it's they're just amazingly extravagant things. And he was known not just in Knoxville for this, but he got some national press in the business industry papers about what a great theater promotional artist he was. His son, by the way, is also an artist and still around. Who's a very talented painter and has done. A lot of people have Joe Parrott Jr. Paintings hanging in their house, as I do actually. But anyway, Popeye Club. This was and that's a significant member, isn't it, of the Popeye Club? Wallace Bowman, who was one of the most generous donors to the Tennessee Theater and leaders of the Tennessee Theater project. Over the years, his painting is hanging in the lobby out there. He died not. It was before they finished the renovation?
No. He died in 2009.
Okay, yeah.
2009.
You got to see the renovation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But he was really devoted to this theater. But he was a member of the Popeye Club, which was a Saturday matinee thing, and they would show Popeye movies and cowboy movies and adventure movies and things like that. But if you were in the Popeye Club and had a number, you were special. They had other clubs down the street at the Bijou, but this was the Popeye Club. I think Tennessee Theater was what introduced Popeye the cartoon to Knoxville, and they were proud of that, and therefore had a Popeye Club. Okay, here's an ad for that Mary of Scotland. This, unless there's been further research, this is the first Broadway show ever shown at the Tennessee Theater, ever presented at the Tennessee Theater in 1935, with a lot of the original cast, especially Helen Hayes. So this was, it was not entirely successful. Helen Hayes said she didn't know what to do with all this space out here, and in the theater couldn't hear it very well, but still it was a landmark in the Tennessee's history. And they had, I think, later that year another Broadway show with much of the original cast called Three Men on a Horse. And in that original cast was a guy named, who was completely unknown at the time, Leonard, whose name you might recognize because he was a major TV producer later on. He did the Andy Griffith Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show and lots of things. You see his name on lots of great old black and white comedies. But he was a kind of a character actor in his early days. He's an actor. He's the bartender in It's a Wonderful Life, the movie. But he was here.
So I was going to say one thing that we can't show you today, but just so you know, when we renovated in 2005, we added 13 dressing rooms downstairs, and each of our dressing rooms are named after significant notable performers who were on the stage at some point or another. So our sort of what's thought of as the best principal star dressing room is named the Helen Hayes room. We also have Tom Mix, Lionel Hampton, Chet Atkins, Johnny Cash, Butterfly McQueen. Anyway, so that's we named those rooms after performers who were on the stage.
All people who are on the stage, and they're all much nicer and bigger than the previous.
Oh
ones.
yes, definitely.
Talk about
we have a photo coming up later of a dressing room pre-renovation. So
yeah. All right, yeah. Let's go to the next. Okay, Glenn Miller. This is when you hear that Glenn Miller was here, you think, well, he gave a concert here. But in those days, jazz bands didn't do concerts; they did dances, and you wouldn't go just sit down and listen to even a very famous pop performer. You expect them to entertain you at a dance. And that's what he was here in town for, to do a dance at UT. But while he was here, he came to the Tennessee Theater to do a live broadcast, apparently out beyond the Knoxville area, on CBS. That they did a 20-minute live broadcast, and this was not a short broadcast by the standards of 1940, which is when he was here. But he was one of the biggest pop stars, jazz band leaders of that day. Of course, he was later lost over the North Sea and during World War II. But was quite a show that night. By the way, the night that Glenn Miller was here at the Tennessee Theater, Cab Calloway was down the street at the Lyric, I believe, and that's a thing to happen on Gay Street. You have two of the biggest pop stars, white and black, in America at the time, playing the same night in Knoxville. And imagine having to make that choice. I think you could probably have caught the Glenn Miller show and then gone down to see Cab Calloway too. All right, here's a great old photograph with the Tennessee Theater from just at the end of the World War II. I can't tell what the movie showing there is, but we're looking, of course, north on Gay Street, and you can see the Farragut Hotel sign in the background. And this blade sign was gone for many, many years. They called it a blade sign, this vertical sign. And they had just the basic marquee at the bottom. In the Tennessee Theater I grew up knowing, it just had that marquee down at the street level. But part of the giant restoration was bringing back that big sign.
Yes, it was removed in the mid 1950s, and the marquee was originally rectangular, and they sheared off the edges, so it became this trapezoid shape, and then it was very updated with neon and fluorescent lights. It was very mid-century style. So when we, in 2005, we kind of took it back to the original 1928 appearance, had a brand new sign fabricated. And 10 years after it was put up, we actually took it down again to refurbish it. And it was easier to refurbish it off-site. So we removed it from the building, shipped it to South Carolina where it was refurbished, and then we brought it back. So some of you may remember that. That was the summer of 2016.
Yeah, you have a big job, Becky. It's not just not just meeting big stars.
It's different every day.
Yeah,
different every day.
Yeah.
Even today, it's still different every day.
I want to mention that every day I walk down Gay Street, I see tourists, and they're taking pictures of themselves with the Tennessee Theater sign in the background. I don't know how many, probably hundreds of thousands of pictures there are around the world now of people taking cell phone, at least pictures of themselves and their friends in front of the Tennessee Theater, just to show where you are. I think that's one of the reasons they take that picture. Also, it's just a great urban scene. But all right, what's next?
What else we got there, Paul? Oh, Grace Moore. Yes. Grace Moore. I will let you know this a lot better than I do off the top of my head. So go ahead, Jack.
Grace Moore was, she actually spent part of her early childhood in kind of the ghetto of Knoxville in a way. It was actually over near the Cripple Creek area, but chose to ignore that in her autobiography, which makes it sound like her youth sound like it was a pastoral country thing. But born in Cocke County, I believe, and raised in Jellicoe, claims her. But she was a very popular Broadway and opera singer, and later one of the first Hollywood musical stars. It's interesting that her name is not as well remembered now, but she was the first person ever nominated for an Oscar for a musical role in Hollywood. But she spent a good time in Knoxville. I'm sure she was in and out of the Tennessee Theater a couple times, but she had been killed in a plane crash in Europe in the late 40s, before there was a movie based on her life that opened here at the Tennessee in 1953 called So This Is Love. And this was one of the highest profile events that's ever happened in the Tennessee Theater, because it was not just local people. It was Katherine Grayson, the famous musical star, two or three other familiar Hollywood people, and a very young guy named kind of the romantic lead in the movie. His name was Merv Griffin, and of course was much later famous for TV productions, and created. If you watch Jeopardy, they have his name on Jeopardy every night because he died years ago. But he was here at the Tennessee Theater in 1953, and may have been the first one ever to play the Tennessee Waltz on stage. He thought that would be it was a hit for Patti Page, or a recent hit, and he played it on the piano up here, and I think he sang it too. So, but this became a Tennessee Theater tradition.
And I'm gonna later, when we get further along on the slides, I'm gonna tell how that tradition got started. It's a great story. So
Yeah, all right.
but we're
Good.
not there yet. So
All right. The Everly Brothers were part of a family act when they came to Knoxville in 1953. They were splitting off and doing their own thing on WROL, whose studios were just a couple of doors down the road, down the sidewalk from the Tennessee Theater, same block, in the 612 building. The Everly Brothers were performing there, and apparently had some serious disagreement with their sponsor, whose name was Kaz Walker. And there are different accounts of what happened, whose fault it was or whatever, but they decided they were not going to deal with him anymore, and they left the fifth floor of the 612 building, came downstairs and walked in here to the Tennessee Theater to console themselves, say, what are we going to do now? We've lost our gig. What's going to be next? And they watched a movie here at the Tennessee Theater called Three Coins and a Fountain. And we know this story because they told it themselves on the stage in the 1990s when they came here for a latter-day show, and talked about exactly where they were sitting when they were kind of nursing their wounds from their scrape with Kaz. But they thought about it, and I don't know if they was in this room, but they decided to take Chet Atkins up on his offer to go to Nashville, and they went over to Nashville and started making records and changed rock and roll history. So Tennessee Theater plays a role that even they recognized when they came here. That by the way is Don on the right and Phil on the left. Phil died a few years ago.
oh,
All right.
oh,
Whoops. Yeah.
back up. There we go.
Yeah, this was one of the big world premieres that they had here. All the Way Home, of course, the James Agee story based on A Death in the Family, which had won the Pulitzer Prize a few years earlier. It was made into a Broadway show, which also separately won the Pulitzer Prize for the guy that adapted it for Broadway. And then it was a movie, and this was one of the biggest, best attended premieres in Knoxville history. Had Gene Simmons, a well-known actor, and the star Robert Preston. And this was, I think, right after The Music Man. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that he went from this bombastic, loud, colorful musical to do a very subdued black and white movie about death, but that it shows his range. But he actually came here. I don't think Gene Simmons came, but Robert Preston came with some of the other cast members, and including Michael Carney, the kid who played the Agee character in the movie, was here and was kind of overwhelmed by the crowds apparently, and was unable to say much on stage.
This is a great shot of that mid-century marquee where you can see the backlit fluorescent lights, the big red snap-on letters, and then
you're right.
The Tennessee, the is usually flashing neon, but for some reason it's off in this picture. Yeah, but it was a red and green flashing neon.
This caught it between flashes, I guess.
I guess so.
But Michael Carney himself, by the way, came back to Knoxville about 5 years ago and had kind of a sentimental journey around town. I think he came by the Tennessee Theater. He's in his mid-60s now, but remembers this is one of the kind of the high points of his life. Anyway, you see some UT band members over here on the left. It's an interesting picture. But there a lot of things went. There had a series of presentations that night. It was an interesting evening. I'm sorry I was too young to know about it at the time, but it was a memorable evening. All right, one thing about the Tennessee Theater that we have to acknowledge is that for its first 35 years, it was an all-white theater, and this was not, of course, unusual. It was that way, and even in a lot of New York theaters have a history like that. But things were changing rapidly in the early 1960s, about the time that this movie was being shown, and it was in 1963 that there was a series of actions led by, especially by Knoxville College students, and that's that's what we're seeing here. That's our old friend Avon Rollins, I believe, lying down, doing a bit of civil disobedience right in front of the Tennessee Theater, as the police are trying to figure out what to do about him. But it was that year that by summer that all the theaters in Knoxville just kind of quietly desegregated. So it was a successful series of actions in the early 60s. But this followed demonstrations against restaurants that involved the city. That happened a couple years earlier, but this was the last, or one of the last things to change were the theaters. But that was Nikki Giovanni has kind of poignant stories about not hearing about Snow White, and it was actually one of the reruns. Snow White came back several times over the years, and she said her father had to explain that they couldn't go see Snow White at the Tennessee Theater. There were a few exceptions over the years. I would be interested to find out all the occasions for this. I think I found about half a dozen exceptions when, especially Black school children, would be let in for a special event, often of a religious nature. The movie The Robe, with one of the big costume sandals and swords dramas of the 1950s, had a one showing that allowed Black people to come in and see it, mainly against students. But anyway, it was an awkward time. Of course, there was around the corner a movie theater called the Gem that was intended for Black people, and it was open every night, and it has its own point of pride in the local history and culture of Knoxville.
Someone commented about the situation of a theater in Alabama, and of course that's the Bijou too, was partially segregated, and that there was a separate entrance, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, and they sat in the second balcony only.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that was one. That was I think the Bijou in the 20th century. That ironically, there were theaters in the 19th century that allowed blacks and whites in various configurations, usually segregated, but sometimes segregated vertically, like the Staub's Opera House would sometimes have blacks on the left, whites on the right. But the Bijou, when it opened in 1909, and this stayed the rule for many, many years until the 60s, had this second balcony was reserved for blacks, and they would enter through basically what looks like a fire escape on the side.
So we'll go ahead to the next slide, Paul. We had somebody comment about children's clubs, and the Popeye Club was only around for just a few years in the 1930s, but this Chipmunk Club went on for quite a while in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was sponsored by the Tom's Potato Chip Company. You could get in for free if you brought an empty bag of Tom's potato chips.
I have to say, Becky, I did come to a few of the Saturday matinees, and I decided I preferred to come to movies with adults. At age 8 or 9, I said I'd rather go with my grandparents or something.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, I'm getting corrected off camera. It was actually Wednesday, as the poster says. Wednesdays, not Saturdays. So everything I have learned about Tennessee Theater, I've learned from my colleague, Tim Burns. He's the technical director here. We've got a picture of him in a little bit. He has been here for 40 years as the technical director. So a wealth of knowledge, and keeps everybody honest around here.
And he's about 40 years old, isn't that right, Tim? Yeah. Happy birthday, by the way.
So this is a shot of the theater the day before it closed in November of 1977. And Wallace Bowman was one of the few people in the 1970s who cared about the theater and was saw its potential and was really worried about it. So when it closed, he asked a photographer to come in and take photographs in case these were the last photographs ever taken of the
Wow.
Tennessee Theater.
Wow.
And you can see a lot of the water damage there up in the blue dome, those white spots, and then just how dingy and dark the gold. You can just compare it from what's behind me here versus what you see on the screen there. The seats were from the 1960s. It was a pretty dingy place, but honestly, it didn't look much different from that all the way up until 2003. So it was a little cleaner probably, but in terms of the plaster damage and the smoke and general coal dust pollution, the walls pretty much looked like that, even all the way up until 2003 when we closed for renovation.
Yeah.
And there it is, November 4th, 1977. Somebody breaking a lot of OSHA rules up there on that ladder, but we won't talk about that. But that was a sad day for the Tennessee Theater. A lot of uncertainty in that period of time. There were, as Jack said, there were several different groups who really had great intentions and wanted to operate the theater. One group reopened it in March of '78, but they failed and it closed again in September of '78. And then it was closed for almost a year, I think, right, Tim? And then Ralph and Robert Frost opened the theater in October of '79. And then a couple of other folks operated it before it was really before it met its angel, I'll say.
And I'm contrary, because I spent many hours in the Tennessee Theater in the late '70s during that interregnum or something when they were showing old. I loved it. It was they were all fascinating to me. It was like completely the black and white movies were kind of terra incognita to me. They were Humphrey Bogart. I'd never seen a Humphrey Bogart movie until about this time, and because they weren't ever on TV, and I just saw one after another in this room, and just had a great time here, often just by myself.
So what's next, Paul? Let's see. Oh, okay, so Chick Corea and Gary Burton play here in 1984, and what's significant about that performance is it is the first performance booked by a young promoter named Ashley Capps. So Ashley was a philosophy major at UT and loved music, and got in cahoots or in contact with the folks who were running the theater at the time, and he essentially rented out the theater to present this show. So Chick Corea and Gary Burton, famous jazz pianist and vibraphonist, was the first Ashley Capps show here at the theater.
Yeah.
So this is the angel of the theater right here, James Dick, who founded Dick Broadcasting. Those locals will know Dick Broadcasting started WIBK FM, and Mr. Dick and his wife Marilyn loved the theater and didn't want to see anything bad happen to it. So they ended up purchasing it from the Atkins family, which was the original developer's family back in the 1920s. And they sunk about $1 million of their own money into the theater and convinced the symphony and the opera to move in and do many of their performances here in the theater in the mid 1980s. So the symphony started in '85 and the opera in 1983.
Yeah. Becky, we got a question last week, I think, about the acoustics of the Tennessee Theater.
Oh yeah.
And how were they improved? Because they weren't always considered all that great. I think they were just passable for some years, and but today a lot of people remark about how great a room it is.
Well, there's a couple of different was designed in the silent era in the 1925, 27. But by the time the theater opened in 1928, most all films had a Vitaphone soundtrack with the picture. It was played on a record player up in the projection booth and connected to the images on the screen and synced up. but that actually caused some problems because of the shape of the room, and they weren't really thinking about what sound, amplified sound would do. And so, Paul, would you go back to that 1977 auditorium shot? So the large sort of beige colored sections there on the wall, with the green rectangle, those were plaster surfaces, but in the probably 1929 or 30, the plaster was covered up with these Celotex acoustical ceiling tiles, with the goal of trying to improve the sound bouncing around in the auditorium. So fast forward to the renovation of the theater, we actually took down those ceiling tiles and put up some special plaster that was acoustically treated and reflects certain frequencies and absorbs others. We also changed there's windows along the back wall, both on the auditorium, orchestra level and the balcony level. And you can open the curtains to reveal a glass surface, which is good for live events, natural sound events like symphony. But for amplified events, we close the curtains so there's less reverberation in the room. So really the main reason that the theater has such good sound now is that every touring act that comes in, they bring their own sound and their own sound engineer, and they spend several hours during sound check to set it up the way that they want it. And it's an odd shaped room, so there are some spots that they're a little funky. It's nothing, in my opinion, like the Bijou, which is just naturally nearly perfect acoustically. But really, the reason that the sound is good here is most of the time it's because it's been engineered to be that way. But it does work well for the symphony too. So.
Yeah, one of the things that makes the Tennessee architecturally unique and maybe troublesome is that it's so broad in the part this part. It has kind of a transverse aspect to it. And you can see that oval in any other theater would be shifted 90 degrees to be to kind of represent the length of the theater rather than the width.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one thing. But one of the biggest changes made by the renovation was this massive cantilevering effort to build the theater over a street to give it a backstage, which it didn't really have before.
Yeah, and we have a picture coming up a little later on that. I'm not sure where we are on pictures, Paul. Let's see, there, Jim Dick. Okay, so yeah, this is a picture of the mezzanine foyer, so upstairs, right before we closed in June of 2003. So that carpet is from 1982. Those curtains are from the 1960s. It's looks like a bad horror movie or something. That bullet trash can there, it's kind of hard to believe that it looked like this. So you can see there we've actually taken those Celotex tiles down. There's a big giant dust mite there floating in the camera. Yeah, it was pretty and really haphazard painting job, just lots of red, nothing too creative in the painting on the plaster detail. But when I started working at the theater in 2001, this is what it looked like. There's another shot of AC Entertainment from 1996. That was the core team. So 1996 is when the nonprofit foundation was started, the Historic Tennessee Theater Foundation. So James Dick donated the theater property to that nonprofit, and then the nonprofit partnered with AC Entertainment to be the management agent and the booking agent for the theater. So these folks really did all the hard work and ran the theater. Tom Bugg is there in the upper left corner with the maroon shirt. He was the manager from 96 until 2001. That's when I came in to be the general manager until 2007. When I left to go to Knox Heritage, Tom came back. So Tom and I are like bad pennies. We just keep showing up, and Tom is still here. So. Yeah,
I bugged Bob. Tom's in charge of some things at the Bijou Theater, and I always bug him every year when he doesn't catch up with how old the Bijou is. It always says for 113 years, whatever it is. I keep I, I keep on him to keep up with with the, how exactly how old the Bijou Theater is.
And one of the reasons that the Tennessee Theater is successful today is the serendipitous relationship and the fact that Ashley decided to stay in Knoxville and work for 30 plus years on developing relationships with these booking agents and artist management companies around the country, Nashville, New York, LA. And AC Entertainment has changed and grown considerably. It's no longer a company of 6 people. It's actually now owned by Live Nation, which is a multinational global corporation.
But they have their own things too. I think Big Ears is their own thing. And,
right. Big Ears is now a separate nonprofit. And that's really Ashley's baby. That's what he's focusing mostly on now. But really that it's an unusual partnership, and, like any marriage, we have our quarrels from time to time, but they're steadfast and very prudent booking of the theater is one of the reasons why it is successful today.
Yeah.
Let's see what's next there, Paul. So yeah, this is one of the old dressing rooms. It kind of looks like a third world prison, but that is what our design team had to work with. Actually, this is actually part of the old stage house underneath that was totally demolished. And I meant to do this earlier, but I noticed when we were logging on and seeing all the folks joining in, I saw an old friend named Daryl Ziegler. And I'm going to call out Daryl. I'm not sure he'll say hello, but Daryl Ziegler was part of the design team from the 2005 renovation. He worked for the theater specialists out of Cleveland, Ohio, Westlake Reed Lescott. And at the time, Daryl was based in Phoenix, and he was the theatrical expert. He used to work for the Joyce Theater in New York City. And so he helped us plan that the stage and the backstage, all of the theatrical and technical equipment that we would need to be a viable and competitive performing arts venue was going to be up to snuff for those who were traveling on the road. Daryl is now happily retired and lives in Honolulu, in Hawaii, not in Honolulu proper, but so I was so happy to see Daryl's name on the screen, and he's a friend of the theater still, and it's we're just great to hear you listening in, Daryl. So let's go to
Hello, hi Becky.
Hi, Daryl. This just shows the scaffolding that was built throughout the auditorium, and where they worked on every square inch of the plaster and paint restoration. It was a company out of New York City called Evergreen. At the time, it was called Evergreen Painting Studios. They're now called Evergreen Architectural Arts. And they've worked on scores of theaters, but also the U.S. Capitol. If you've been to New York since they renovated the beautiful Grand Central Terminal, his company, Jeff Green's company, did all the renovation of that. The Empire State Building. A lot of the theaters on Broadway, the big theaters in L.A. So we got the best of the best in terms of paint and plaster restoration team to do this work here. So you can see that's the dome that's up above us here, but there was a scaffold that was built all the way across the room so that they could get up and work in the ceiling. And this is a great picture where you can we see them putting on that aluminum leaf that was then glazed over with a gold glaze to make it look like gold leaf. So it's not really gold leaf, it's aluminum leaf, which is more durable and obviously a lot less expensive. There's another picture a little bit later on in the process. It was really fun to go up there and watch them work. And we did have wet paint the day that we opened. There was wet paint drying in some of the corners. We worked to the very last minute. This is a great shot of the lobby when all the chandeliers and all the decorative lighting had been removed. All of that was restored by a company out of St. Louis called the St. Louis Antique Lighting Company. You can also see that we were working on the terrazzo floor and the carpet had been removed, but this was after looks like they'd already finished a lot of the paint and plaster work in the lobby. But this is what it looked like for many, many months. It was a 19-month, $26 million renovation project. And there's the auditorium with the seats removed. And those large steel beams that are coming down into the house, the reason that we had those is that we actually demolished the entire stage house. So basically exactly where I'm sitting on the edge of the stage, back upstage was removed off of the back of the building. And so we were a little bit afraid that maybe the proscenium opening above us would collapse. And so they braced it with these steel braces here. And then as Jack said, they built a new stage house that was bigger. And I think maybe the next picture is that one. If not, it's coming up soon. Yeah, so the reason I chose this picture is that it really shows, Paul, if you can kind of move your cursor right up along that center line, like where the brick wall to the right, yeah, right there. So that is the original depth of the auditorium. It was only, or the stage, it was only about 24 feet deep from where I'm sitting right now to the back wall. But if we were going to ever be a competitive and really functional performance venue, we needed a bigger stage, but we couldn't close the street because it's an active city street. So we did what's called an inverse cantilever over the street. So the weight of the stage is transferred up through that steel girder and down into caissons that are drilled all the way down into bedrock, which go down about 80 feet into the ground to support the weight of the stage. So that extra 20 feet or so that hangs out over State Street gives us the depth that we need for the large touring Broadway shows that we present here. I think Miss Saigon was, what, 15 tractor trailer trucks? Is that right? Saigon? I think, yeah, Miss Saigon was 15 tractor trailer trucks. Les Mis was 12 or 13 trucks. So these are really, really big shows that take up every square inch of that stage, for sure.
Yeah, and there's also an elevator that can take horses up to stage, as I saw at I think a Girl of the Golden West when they had the opera here. There were horses that didn't have to come in like Tom Mix's horse in through the lobby. They can load them in through the backstage.
So Penny asked about, were there pictures of the theater and the lobby from the beginning? Yes. Jim Thompson, who was a very prolific photographer in the early part of the 20th century in Knoxville, he took I think over 100 photos of the theater within the first couple of weeks after it opened. And the McClung collection has some of those. I think we have found about 30 of those photos.
And there's some very, very good reproductions of them in a book called Historic Tennessee Theater.
So yeah, those we
which,
decided not to show you those pictures just because there's not enough time to talk about everything. But yes, we do have a great photographic record of the theater from the early 1920s or the late 1920s.
Yeah.
All right, what's next, Paul? Okay, so this picture. This is a great picture for several reasons. Bill Snyder, there on the left, was for a time the chancellor of the University of Tennessee. He was the dean of the engineering school. He was a professor, but his true love was this theater, is this theater. Bill is still with us. He's just not, he's retired from his role, but he began playing the Wurlitzer organ here in 1978, I think, 77, 78. Is that right, Tim? And but when Ralph and Robert Frost became the managers and they leased the theater, they wanted to do something special, and they thought it might be a great idea to have the organ played before every film. And so Bill wanted to do it, and so his first time at the organ bench as the official house organist of the Tennessee Theater was on October 18th, 1979, which also happened to be Bill's birthday. And it was also the first day that Tim Burns worked as the technical director of the theater. So there's Bill and Tim sitting at the Wurlitzer console with the poster from that 1979 re-screening of that classic San Francisco film from the 1930s. So the story of the Tennessee Waltz, and I may give get this a little bit wrong, but Tim and a couple of guys were in the building and they were painting the screen. So they were basically making it wide enough to be effective and work for a movie And so Bill was here and Bob Frost was here, and they had already thought of a piece of music to rise the organ up out of the pit, but they needed to think of a song to lower the organ down at the end of the set. And so they were tossing around a couple of ideas, and Tim said, "What about the Tennessee Waltz?" And if you know Bill Snyder, you know that he is the ultimate diplomat. And he told us later that internally he said, "Ugh, that song, it's, so horrible and it's so overdone and nobody will like it." But outwardly he said, "Well, yeah, why don't we try that, Tim? Are you sure that's a good idea?" Tim said, "I think you should try that." So played the Tennessee Waltz as the down music at the end of that first night, and it was a roaring success, and we have done it virtually, I guess, every movie since. So that is how the Tennessee Waltz became the traditional down music for the Wurlitzer organ.
I think I was there that night, and I had no idea how significant an evening it was.
So yeah, there's a copy of our book. We're proud of this book for several reasons. Number one, that Jack took so much care and time. If we had let him, he would have probably written another 100 pages, but we couldn't afford to get it printed any more pages. So this is 228 pages of text and beautiful imagery. It was designed locally by Robin Easter Design, and then it was printed here in Tennessee by a company in Nashville. So it's a real local product. And we released it as the 10th anniversary of the renovation project. So we released it in 2015. And it's a wonderful record of the theater, its beginnings, its up days, its highs and lows and everything in between. And that's available on our website, which, thank you, Paul, is right there on our screen, TennesseeTheater.com. We also have a lot of other great items in our gift shop that you can buy. We just re-announced our blade sign ornament, went for sale yesterday. So I know we've already sold about half of our inventory. So if you are a holiday ornament collector, you might want to get that very quickly. And then, as I mentioned before, that this is a really difficult time for the theater, not able to earn its revenue through ticket sales and rental fees. We, as a nonprofit, we're lucky, and when things are going well, that we cover about 95% of our budget through that earned revenue. That has dropped to zero. And so every dollar that we're bringing in most of it is donated money. So you can support the theater, every dollar makes a difference. We have a special called TennesseeTheater.com/closure support. And that's just a way that you can help the theater while it can't earn its own income.
Yeah, and sales of the book go entirely to the theater foundation.
Yes,
right?
They do.
So,
and then
well,
I was going to say, you mentioned earlier, we're doing a couple of other creative things. We set up a Christmas tree in the lobby, and people have always asked us to come in and take photographs during the holiday season with their families, but we're too busy usually in November and December, but we're not busy now. So actually it's in late August where you can sign up for a slot, have a professional photographer take your photograph in the theater, and if you want a theme, we've got a tree set up and everything. So.
Yeah, this will be kind of a somber chapter for the second edition of the book.
That's right.
But is that it for the slides?
Yeah,
that's all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thank everybody for coming. The Tennessee Theater has a fascinating history, and I think we've just begun to scratch the surface of it in some ways. But honestly, the Tennessee Theater is more famous today than it was in the 1920s and 30s when Fanny Brice and all these other people were here, because of things like Big Ears and because of people around the world coming here to see the Tennessee Theater and writing about it in papers in other parts of the world. But it's a place with a great deal of history, and there's not enough that you could say about it.